Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's IRR press briefing. We're going to be doing a briefing on our latest polling data, the Real South Africa Race, Reality and Reasons for Hope. So a lot of pundits and people, if you are kind of active in the South African political space, will talk at length about what South Africans want or what South Africans believe or how South Africans feel. But the IRR every year goes out and actually asks South Africans how they feel and what they think about a variety of topics. So taking you through that today will be my colleague Hermann Pretorius, who is the IRR's head of strategic communications. His presentation should be about 35 minutes long, and afterwards we will take a couple of questions. So without any more, let me hand over to you, Hermann.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good morning, everyone. So the title of today's presentation is The Real South Africa, Race, Reality and Reasons for Hope. And we will be touching on all those points throughout this morning's briefing. First of all, a few methodological points on the survey data you are about to see. The survey was conducted during October 2023 with a sample size of 604, a margin of error, a standard margin of error of 3.9 or 4%, and a confidence interval of 95%. The sample is demographically and socioeconomically representative and was accordingly weighted. Without further ado, let us get into the content of today. Firstly, I will be taking you through the main key headline points from the polling data. Then I will take you deeper into the questions of policies and politics. And finally, we will conclude with some key takeaways. Starting with the question of polling. Let's look at life in South Africa. The question currently before you is simple. Is your life better, the same as, or worse than 5 years ago? Now, this is a question that we have asked on several occasions in our polling, and you can see in front of you compared the 2022 results to the 2023 results. And they are as follows. 53.9% of South Africans believed in 2022 that their life had become worse than 5 years prior. That has fallen to 48.4% this year. On whether life has remained the same in the last 5 years, in 2022, that figure stood at 19.9%, and that has risen to 23.3%. Whether life has become better in the last 5 years, we see the data shows 25.2% and 27.9%. The don't knows and the refused are statistically insignificant, but presented there for some clarity. We see, therefore, in the data in front of you, a hint of optimism, and one could understand that this comes off the back of the end of much of the COVID perception of crisis. We also look forward to the 2024 elections, and a feeling of empowerment and an impending exercise of a democratic right might explain some of that improvement. Looking at the question from today for the next 5 years, do you think life 5 years from now will be better, the same or worse than today. Again, a theme of optimism seems to be emerging. Compared to 2022, 2023's results are markedly better, especially for the worse category. That figure has gone from 43.8% to 34.3%. On the question of the opinion that life will remain the same, South Africans in 2022 counted 9.1% in that category, and that has risen to 12.5%. The question of whether you think life will be better also shows that swing towards a more optimistic outlook. In 2022, that number was 33.6%, and in 2023, that stood at 36.4%. Don't know and refuse this time a bit higher, with a don't knows within the mid to low teens in both 2022 and 2023. Then we look at something that is, of course, of vital importance to South Africa as a whole and to the Institute of Race Relations in particular. We look at race relations. Firstly, we asked, since 1994, have relations between people of different races in South Africa improved, stayed the same, or become worse? The donut chart in front of you is an overview that gives you something of a sense that it seems to be a 50-50 split, with the improved sentiment representing 49% of the national population. Then we look at stayed the same. That stands around 18%, and become worse at 32%. As this is an overall view, let us look at this question by the categories available on race. Broken down by race, we see that white South Africans, by a vast majority of 83%, believe in 2023 that race relations have improved since 1994. Indian South Africans, or South Africans of Indian origin, believe by 45% that life had become, race relations have improved, but also by the same number that race relations have worsened since 1994. A marginal plurality of colored voters, colored South Africans, believe with 35% that race relations have improved since 1994, compared to 34% saying they've gotten worse. So roughly the same. Black South Africans are of the opinion, with 46% to 31.8%, that race relations have improved in South Africa since 1994. Pardon me. I looked at the data incorrectly. The colored became worse, and improved numbers are 45% became worse, and 35% have improved. And we will return to that important data point a bit later. If you're an Indian South African, 23% of South Africans of Indian origin believe that race relations have become worse, and 45% that they have improved. Then Black South Africans, 34% that they have become worse, and 46% that they have improved. Overall, as I said earlier, about 50%, 49.2% in this instance, believe that race relations have improved, with 31.8% of the overall population saying the opposite. We will return to this in the key takeaways, and it is an important factor to consider in the question of policy analysis. We move then on to the question of, have you personally experienced any form of racism in the past 5 years? The pie chart in front of you, or the donut chart in front of you, presents that as an overall picture. Again, a somewhat positive balance there, with just short of 60% of South Africans saying they have not experienced personally racism of any form in the last 5 years. 41.4% say they have. Again, breaking this number down by the racial categories. White South Africans are split 50-50 on whether they have experienced personally, in the last 5 years, any form of racism. Indian voters, or Indian South Africans, pardon me, have a significantly different spread here. 77% of Indian South Africans say they have experienced racism in the last 5 years, compared to 23% who said they have not. Colored voters are closer to a 50-50 split, with having experienced racism eking out, with 53% of colored South Africans saying they have experienced such racism in the last 5 years, compared to 47% who say the opposite. Black South Africans are split 60%, saying that they have not experienced racism in the last 5 years, with 40% saying they have. And the overall figure is that 59 to 41% split. We move then on to the perception of racism, colonialism, and whether voters agree with some political analysis that excuses are to be found in racial or colonial era-based rhetoric. All this talk of racism and colonialism is by politicians who are trying to find excuses for their own failures. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Close to 70% agree with that statement, with 67% saying they do believe that all the talk of racism and colonialism is by politicians who are trying to find excuses for their failures. 31% disagree with that statement. Broken down by racial categories. White South Africans believe with 90% that talk of racism and colonialism is by politicians trying to find excuses. 7% disagree. Indian South Africans, 100%. Of course, that might well be within the margin of error of 4%, so that number might be as low as 96%, which is quite high still. Believe that talk of racism and colonialism is by politicians seeking excuses. Colored voters agree with that statement to the tune of 89%, and black voters agree with that statement to the tune of 60%. It is important here, therefore, for politicians to realize that blaming apartheid, racism, colonialism can only go so far as a political tool as we head into the elections. And it is worrying that we are likely to see an uptick in this sort of rhetoric if past election cycles are any worth indicating. Then we ask the question, do the different races of South Africa need each other for progress? And should there be full opportunity for all? Again, we see a very similar number emerge, close to 70%, 67% agreeing with that statement that the races need each other for progress and that opportunity should be for all. 31% disagree with that statement. Taking that same question by racial categories, the same picture emerges. We then move on to something that is perhaps particularly pertinent in a World Cup year of both cricket and rugby. One of those teams achieving success, the other less so. And both of them having been over the last few years subject to some political and public debate on how to handle the question of race and race quotas. The question we put to South Africans was, do you believe that South African sports teams should be selected only on merit and ability and not by racial quotas? The answer is overwhelming, with a 90% saying yes and an 8% saying no. Breaking those numbers down by race echoes that this is quite a unifying issue for South Africans, and it is worth noting that race is a unifying issue for South Africans, but not necessarily in the negative sense. 96% of white South Africans agree with the statement that sports teams should be selected on merit and ability and not on racial quotas. 100% of Indian South Africans, 91% of colored voters, and 89% of Black South Africans, giving that total to 90%. Pardon me, I'm not quite sure what currently seems to be the case. I made a mistake with that headline. Pardon me. The question there should be, do you believe that teachers should be the same race as your child, or should the best teacher, no matter their race, teach your child? Do pardon me for that oversight of that slide heading. We see a positive split, similar to the race question on sports, with 89.2%, close to that 90% with the previous question, affirming the position that the best teacher, no matter their race, should be in charge of the child's education of the average South African. With the negative of that standing at around 10% compared to the 8% on the previous sports-related question. If we break this issue down by race, again, you see a clustering of the numbers clearly at the higher end of the probability, given that the margin of error for this sample is 4%, the lowest possible number of Black South Africans who agree that teachers of merit should be preferred over teachers of a specific race is 80%, with our data putting it at 84. For colored South Africans, that number is 89, for Indian South Africans, 100, and for white South Africans, 95. Closely related to race relations is the question of immigration. And this is the first time we have asked this question as the IRR, where most of our previous questions have been part of questionnaires in previous years. The question we put is as follows: what impact does illegal immigration have on South Africa's unemployment numbers? On the extreme sides of the argument, not extreme in the ideological sense, but at both ends of the spectrum of this issue, you see a vaguely similar split, with 22.2% of South Africans saying that illegal immigration is almost entirely to blame for our unemployment problem, and 20.4% of South Africans claiming the exact opposite, or not the exact opposite, but close. Illegal immigration contributes almost nothing to our unemployment problem. Then the two more centrist categories here from the range of options that people were presented, we see that the quite clear winner, with close to 50% of support among South Africans, is the statement that illegal immigration is a large contributor to our unemployment problem. And just under 10% of South Africans say illegal immigration is a small contributor to our unemployment problem. What underlies this data is something we will get to in a moment. We then ask whether South Africans prefer a political party which promises faster economic growth and more jobs, or one which promises land expropriation without compensation as redress for past wrongs. I categorized this question in the Department of Race Relations. Even though it isn't explicitly on race relations, it is quite often used as a wedge issue between races. The claim is that there is a festering or a burning hunger for land amongst Black South Africans, and that South Africans of white heritage feel differently about this issue. While that might be true, certainly on a small scale, if we look at an overall weighting of these issues, comparing the question of expropriation without compensation, EWC, asking whether a political party should focus on economic growth and more jobs or land expropriation, the answer is quite formidable in favor of jobs. 82.8% of South Africans believe that jobs should outweigh the question of land expropriation, with 13.2% taking the opposite view. We move on to the question of whether better education and more jobs will decrease inequality within South Africa. Again, not an explicitly racial question, but worth considering within the racial debate of our country, as inequality, like property rights, is often considered a wedge issue. However, what emerges is something of a reason for hope. 75% of South Africans agree with the statement that with better education and more jobs, inequality will decrease within South Africa, with only 21% taking the opposite view. When we look at the priorities of voters later, we will also see how this is mirrored in other data sets as well. And we come to that now. We look at policies and politics, having established what South Africans consider over the last 5 years of their life, of having experienced racism or not, and looking socioeconomically forward to the next 5 years, we now look at what these South Africans expect from the policy and political arenas. What should the top priorities of the government be? Again, we see something quite interesting that I want to draw your attention to. Ironically, if you look to the far right of the spectrum, you will see the least opted for issues are land reform and racism. Yet these issues often dominate the political discourse in South Africa. And there should be some question as to why that is and whether that is a fair representation of South Africa. At the other end of the spectrum, we look at unemployment and the need for creating jobs as, again, a clear winner in terms of what government focus should be, followed by corruption, and then thirdly, the abuse of women and children on 18%. It is worth noting that this issue has over the last few years climbed in relevance and now frequently ranks among the top issues, where in the past it seemed more of a social issue, and it might now have taken on a socio-economic component, worthwhile and merited all the same. Fourth, we look at electricity and load shedding being a massive issue that people want the government to focus on. In the fifth position, illegal immigration. As I've mentioned before, this issue has heated up over the last few years and now occupies commonly the high echelons of this ranking system. Crime or safety and security, and water round out what one might see as the first order priorities, all of them above 10%. Moving on, one sees education, healthcare, Black economic empowerment, housing, all on 7%, followed closely by poverty, infrastructure, service delivery, inequality and gender and racial inequality, and finally, racism and land reform. We return to this question in our key takeaways section when I draw your attention to something that I think the data quite indicates clearly. But the next question was more of an ideological question, a question of whether South Africans want more power to the state or the inverse. The question was, in your opinion, would tax-funded vouchers for schooling, healthcare, and housing be more effective in helping you to get ahead than current affirmative action and BEE policies, which focus on management posts, ownership deals, and preferential tenders? We see that 84% of South Africans agree that these tax-funded vouchers would offer a more direct route to socioeconomic improvement, compared to 12% who disagree. Breaking this issue down by race is of some interest here. It is often considered a white policy by its critics that you want a decentralized government which makes the choice of the individual prime in its power and resource distribution. However, the inverse seems to be the case, with Black voters to the tune of 88%, compared to white voters to the tune of 64%, preferring the voucher-based approach. 64% amongst white South Africans is still a significant majority, make no mistake about it. But it is interesting to understand that the voucher system or the voucher notion is not one that cuts so neatly to the racial prejudices and perceptions of some in the commentariat class. Again, we see a relatively close cluster with all race groups agreeing that a state-funded voucher, a tax-funded voucher system for schooling, healthcare, and housing would be more beneficial than the current efforts of affirmative action and BEE policies. Having dealt with the policy side of things, we now look at how this might manifest in the political democratic participation of 2024. What are the chances of you voting in the 2024 general elections? 80.9%, almost certain, 2.3% probably, and 13.8% 50-50, with a will not vote or don't know or refused around 1.5%. It is worth noting that here is a question that is open to some virtue signaling contamination of the data. So whilst this might largely be right, indicating an eagerness to vote, or at least the acceptance of a moral duty to vote, that the previous South African elections have not seen turnout of 80.9%. It would be a remarkable turnout indeed, but it is prudent to expect a turnout closer to 60 or 65% compared to the 80% of respondents, and indicating that turnout from this. We then move to a question that we also haven't asked before, but a question that within the global context becomes increasingly important, and that is the perception of electoral fairness. Question: will the 2024 national elections be free and fair? Again, we see some reason for optimism, with 62% of South Africans saying yes, 23% of South Africans saying no, with 14% undecided. That is a relatively high undecided number here, and it is, I think, something positive. The IEC, the political parties, the government, and civil society in general must see that there's an opportunity here to boost the legitimacy of South Africa's elections to the mid-70s, which would put it in a very healthy position. While 23% saying no, the elections will not be free and fair is worrying, I do think we should take solace from the fact that democracy in South Africa still commands something of a majority, with potential for growth, significant potential for growth, close to a 3/4 majority, if those undecideds could be swung between now and election day. The stay away vote in South Africa has become increasingly important, with more South Africans choosing not to vote who could vote than voting. We delve into that for a moment. We pulsed reasons for not voting in the 2024 general election. Firstly, I don't trust any of the political parties to deliver. In first place with 28.8%. I can't get to the station, 15%. I find politics distasteful, 15%. Voting won't make a difference, 13.7%. No party represents me, a significant drop from the first 4 categories. No party presents me on 4.6%. I do not trust the voting process, 2.6%. Undecided and refused being significant chunks of the data there. What we should understand here, from the first 4 categories ranking highest, is that these are changeable categories. I don't trust the political parties to deliver. That is up to parties to change. That perception is changeable. And if parties occupy the minds of voters with a clear message, then trust could be restored, a key threat to any electoral mandate that might emerge. The question of not being able to get to the voting station is something that we will have to keep an eye on. It is the logistics of voting day, and particularly the rural and the elderly is likely to be affected by this. This issue, again, can either be taken up by the political parties or by the IEC, or by citizens themselves. We all know people who live in rural areas, remote areas, and we all know the elderly. There is something here to be said for ordinary South Africans engaging with each other to overcome this particular barrier. I find politics distasteful. Well, I'm surprised it is that low. Politics do not have the greatest reputation in South Africa. But again, this is an issue that can be addressed, this time not by the IEC and sometimes by political parties, but I would argue mostly by the citizens of this country. If you find politics distasteful, I do think there is scope for you to exert influence over that, but only if you participate. Voting won't make a difference. Similar to the first category, that is up to those in power to change. We move then on to a more controversial topic of whether the ANC will accept a loss, with a question reading, what reaction are you anticipating from the ANC should they lose the 2024 election? Mirroring something of a distrust in politics and the governing party in particular, 60% of South Africans believe that the ANC would resort to undemocratic means in an attempt to continue to govern. I think, and some of my colleagues agree with me, that this number is unrealistically fearful, paranoid, and high perhaps, but not without merit. If one considers where the ANC has lost power, at provincial level, we certainly see efforts in the Western Cape following the DA's victory there in 2009 to make the province, quote unquote, ungovernable. More recently, we look at local municipalities like Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, and Johannesburg, where the ANC's loss of executive command was met with some destabilization tactics, with some provincial ANC leaders in Gauteng blatantly endorsing such an approach. It is up to the ANC to prove that it is a democratic party. If it isn't, the judgment of these voters, of these South Africans, will be right. And it is something to watch out for, the infamous ungovernability tactic. The ANC would accept the loss. 29.8% of South Africans agree with that. Looking towards the realistic effects of politics so far, and perhaps something of a bird's eye view, we look at by-election performance since the 2021 local government elections. The ANC has seen a net loss of 16 seats. It has held 87 seats. It has gained 7, but it has lost 23. The IFP, coming in with the best performance amongst the considered parties since the 2021 LGE, sits on a net gain of 10, an impressive record and an impressive recovery for a party that a decade ago was written off. We look at them holding 12 seats, gaining 12 seats, and losing 2. The NFP, the splinter party from the IFP, have a net gain of 1. They have held 1, they have gained 1, and they have lost none. I will move on to the DA and the EFF and the Patriotic Alliance, followed by the Freedom Front Plus, to make efficient use of my time. The DA has seen a net loss of 1 seat. That should be some reason for worry for the DA. However, it is to be expected with a political party having a rather restrictive and conservative by-election approach, that by-elections are not contested by default, and that might explain that relatively stagnant and stable number. However, a -1 there is less than encouraging for the DA. The EFF, however, contrary to the reputation of being a party that does not do well in by-elections, have seen a net gain of 9 seats, holding 1 and gaining 9, losing 0. The PA, for a new and relatively small regional party, by all means, by all measures, have done well, with a net gain of 3, a loss of 1, and a gross gain of 4, having defended none successfully, but that's possibly because none were there to defend within a by-election context. The Freedom Front Plus, stable, having gained one, having lost one. Final point from the data in front of you to measure is the competition that might emerge in next year's elections between the Patriotic Alliance and the Good Party, here to a significant degree mirroring the net gain, net loss margin. Both parties seem to contest a predominantly colored vote in the Western Cape. And looking back to the 90s, then the 2000s, 2010, there seems to be a significant chunk of very pragmatic colored voters in South Africa willing to shift from the ANC, the NP, the DA, Good, the Independent Democrats, and now possibly added to that mix, the Patriotic Alliance. Moving then into the leadership stakes. Cyril Ramaphosa remains by quite some margin the most popular politician in South Africa on 41.9%. Second, Jacob Zuma, 33.5%. Julius Malema in third place, 21.7%. Mmusi Maimane, 90%. Helen Zille, 18.5%. John Steenhuisen, 14.7%. Willem Kostini Labisa of the IFP, 12.1%. Jordan Hill-Lewis, Mayor of Cape Town, 10.8%. Gayton Kenzie, leader of the Patriotic Alliance, 10.4%. Hermann Mashaba, leader of Action SA, 10.4%. Pieter Groenewald, leader of the Freedom Front Plus, 7.7%. Chris Pappas, the DA's Umgeni mayor, 5.4%. And the newest entry to South Africa's political gauntlet, Singwezo Zibi of Rise and Zanzi on 3.2%. However, favorability isn't the only side of that coin. We also look at unfavorability, where Mr. Malema performs, perhaps to his detriment, quite well, with 56.6% of South Africans having an unfavorable view of him. These favorability and unfavorability numbers are the total of somewhat and strongly favorable and unfavorable ratings. Jacob Zuma, a polarizing figure, second in both favorable ratings and unfavorable ratings. Helen Zille being quite unfavorable at 46.3%. Mmusi Maimane at the same mark. Cyril Ramaphosa having an unfavorability rating of 37.1. Hermann Mashaba seeing some worrying data of an inverse, where his unfavorability is double that, more than, of his favorability at 31.1%, and John Steenhuisen, a similar deficit with 24.1. It is important, however, to note that these politicians from Mr. Mashaba and downwards on this particular list have significant scope for improving their favorability ratings, as might be deducted from the data that they seem to have a great unfamiliarity quotient or low name recognition. To the meat and potatoes of the political section. If the general election was held today, who would you vote for? In 2022, the ANC was languishing in the low 40s and have since recovered to the mid 40s, going from 41.8% to 46.5%. The Democratic Alliance see also an improvement of their standing, up from 24.2 to 26.1. The Economic Freedom Fighters going from 15.5 to 11.6. I do remind, however, that the margin of error for this poll is around 4%, so we might see more stability with the EFF's numbers in a real election scenario. The IFP is particularly worth noting here. They have reached almost the double digits, a feat they achieved at their might, at their peak of their powers. The resurgence of the IFP from by-elections to its standing in the national polls is something of an encouragement for Zulu nationalist voters, Zulu conservative voters, and of course the multi-charter parties, a tongue twister. But these parties, with a mutual recovery, can most certainly reach a point of political support for opposition parties thus far unknown. Moving on to our takeaway section. Firstly, we look at the likelihoods of what might happen after the election. And what you see on the screen is the ANC's vote share in 5 possible scenarios. To the left, the ANC getting 50% of the vote. We consider that at a relative probability, with the necessary consequences shown in the next slide. These are realistically the span of where we believe the ANC will fall, just reaching 50 to a very low of 30%. This translates to a rather politically interesting future, and I credit my colleagues at the Center for Risk Analysis for this particular slide. We see here two axes: vertically, stability to volatility, and horizontally, business as usual to impact and disruption. The chart then shows what constellations or permutations of the vote could deliver what types of government. Let us take it from the bottom left. The ANC reaching 50% of the vote to the bottom left would be the most stable option and the most business as usual option. Stable here, not in the socioeconomic sense, stable here in the policy and political disruption sense. Things will broadly stay the same. The ANC having to force a coalition, if we look at the previous slide, when it gets 45 to 40% of the vote, becomes more disruptive, marginally, and more volatile, but still within a similar quadrant. A coalition between the ANC and the EFF, where the ANC receives 40 to 44% of the vote, you see at the right-hand side of the spectrum in front of you, where it is significantly disruptive and above what we could consider an acceptable level of some volatility taken with that level of disruption. Looking at the ANC support at 34 to 39%, the odds of an ANC-DA government is volatile in the sense that the political parties will have significant scope for ironing out differences and some pressure on that. But it will maintain something of a stability quotient, being almost the only occupant of that particular quadrant. Finally, with the ANC reaching 30 to 34% of the vote, one will see the most volatile, but not the most disruptive government constellation of the multi-party charter, of the DA and its allies. What are the key takeaways of today? Number one, I would say race relations in South Africa are sound, but with underlying negative shifts amongst races excluded from government policies like BE. We see that in the priorities of voters mirrored, and we see that BEE, land reform, racism policies are, according to voters, not high in popularity. The next takeaway is South Africa is in an era of coalitions for the foreseeable future. We see increased uncertainty as the likely driver of an upsurge in anti-legal immigrant convictions. And the next bullet is, I think, the key takeaway that I take from this data. South Africans are driven by concerns over opportunities and safety. Whether one looks at the priority polling, whether one looks at the illegal immigration polling, the question of opportunities seems to be the underlying cause. Where South Africans believe opportunities are available, they are positive. Where opportunities are compromised, we see the negativity coming in. I would therefore urge South African political parties, the media, and the public to look at that last point and understand that the landscape of South Africa is close to a blank slate for change. Give the South Africans the opportunities and the safety and the upward momentum of such socioeconomic progress, and that blank slate could become the canvas for a growing, prosperous, and free South Africa. Thank you very much. I will now take questions. Nick, let us take 3 questions in a go, unless we are running short on time. Or Nick, would you say 1 question perhaps, I think, at the time? What's your judgment? I take it.
Let's see how it goes. Let's start with 1 and then see how we go from there. So a question here is, how does the IRR feel about the government's policy of BEE and how it affects race relations? Do people understand that government is to blame, or does the anger at BEE impact relations between people as well?
A very good question. It goes without saying, the IRR is against BEE as a policy. Our almost century-long heritage of standing against race-based policies put us in good company here when we fought against apartheid. And I think we look at the political landscape and see an emergence of a return to non-racialism. Past data from the IRR has shown that roughly 10 to 15% of Black South Africans believe that BEE has benefited them. That gives us a figure of around 85 to 90% of Black South Africans believing BEE has not benefited them. Combine that with the data you saw about the talk of racism and colonialism as an excuse for failure, and you see that the problems in South Africa are well understood, the consequences of the policies are well understood. What might not be well understood, and we didn't look at that today, but might be worth looking at in the future, is where the parties themselves communicate effectively on this issue. Do voters understand that BEE has failed? I think so, yes. Otherwise, they would have ranked it higher. Jobs ranks consistently as the main issue. And as that key takeaway indicates, opportunities is what drives the matter here. And I think South Africans, whilst perhaps not sophisticated to the traditional sense, are by no means stupid. And they understand that opportunities cannot always come from the government, but there might be some role for the government, and what that role is, political parties should clearly communicate.
So a common question is often about how, about sample sizes. We've seen it in many places, and occasionally criticism of IRR polling and other polling as well, say, oh, you only asked 2,000 people, or you only asked 600 people. How can you say that this is representative of the population?
I would give two answers to that. Number one, people shouldn't misunderstand sampling, and they shouldn't see that as a necessary indicator of quality of data. Sample size is only one component of what delivers a reliable data set. Randomness of selection is another one, of course, weighting, representativity, all of these things contribute to the overall accuracy and integrity of the data. So whilst the sample size here of 604 is by no means the largest we've ever seen, we can compare it to its own integrity and find that margin of error of 4%, giving us, with a 95% conviction or a certainty rating. However, we should also see this in context. We should always warn people that polling isn't a magic ball. It isn't a crystal ball looking at the future and discovering the unknown currents of opinion. It is part of what one might consider quantitative analysis of intangible goods. The problem here is that you see it within the context of other data points. You compare it to other polling sets. For example, the Brenthurst Foundation having published a few weeks ago, polling data on a much larger sample size, about twice our size, getting very, very similar conclusions. So number one, I would say the reliability of the methodology consists of more than just the sample size. And secondly, if that isn't enough, compare it to other sources of polling data, and you will see it bears out the fundamental judgments of the data here.
Another question is about President Cyril Ramaphosa. He remains in the polling data that you presented today the most popular politician. How does that compare to his standing earlier? Was he more or less popular back in, 2020, 2021, that kind of period?
At that time, particularly during the COVID-19 situation, you saw a massive spike in the incumbents' approval ratings across the world. It was seen in Australia, Germany, the UK, and South Africa. President Ramaphosa came into office in 2018 with sky-high approval ratings to start with. After that, he did see a knock to his ratings, but during COVID, that recovered to some polls putting him at the high 60s. If you look at opinion polls since, Brenthurst Foundation, the South Africa Barometer, the Social Research Foundation, you see varying indicators of President Ramaphosa's popularity. But the question that really drives the popularity of President Ramaphosa is the extent to which he is associated with his dual roles of leader of the ANC versus president of the country. The ANC being significantly less popular today than 10 years ago. Whenever Ramaphosa is most closely associated with the ANC, he sees a decline in his in his approval ratings. In the role of statesman, he sees a significantly better performance in that. So President Ramaphosa's role is a difficult one. Can he distance himself from the unpopularity of his party, but still cash in politically on the political assets of his own personal likability that seems to remain high, whatever one's personal convictions might be? He retains a goodwill and an approval rating that is significantly higher than any of his current political competitors.
So I think we're going to take one more question here. And this one reads, the ANC marches ahead with the NDR, race quotas, NHI, BEE. What does the IRR believe the message for parties should be if they want to convince voters in the upcoming election? So far, South Africa's opposition parties have struggled to get a foothold in the national dialogue.
What the IRR's position will be, I won't venture to guess. That would be erring a bit too closely to the concept of having a set party line, but I can perhaps give my own advice from my position and the data. It is clear that the data concludes towards an opportunity-based message. South Africans are not ideologues, yet their ideology, if anything, errs towards the center-right in the traditional economic sense of the word, perhaps not the social sense of the word. R.W. Johnson's polling as far back as 2019 indicates that even ANC voters are more eager for the party to position itself alongside small businesses and corporate interests, capitalism as it were, than the negative amongst ANC voters themselves. So I would say an opportunity-based, competence-based, merit-based approach, where you can, through opportunities, address socioeconomic woes, through merit, appointments, improve the performance of state-run entities and government departments. Merit and opportunity and non-racialism seem to be the key things that South Africans have in common, perhaps most explicitly identified by the fact that a vast majority of South Africans desire something like a voucher system where the government might participate in terms of taking tax revenue and channeling it towards certain issues, but the individual maintaining choice, the opportunity to exercise it by their good judgment.
All right, thank you very much, Herman, and thank you everyone for attending today. As Herman mentioned at the beginning, the slides will be available upon request and also on the IRR's website. And we hope that you all found this presentation today very interesting and informative. I think it's always a great practice and often, I think, very humbling for analysts, pundits, or even just ordinary people who are kind of trying to get a sense of what's going on in South Africa to look at what information we have available about what most South Africans actually believe. Not everyone is leaving comments on social media. Not everyone has an opinion column that they can write up their thoughts about the country. And yet it's very important to know what our fellow South Africans are thinking. Anyway, thank you very much, and we shall see you all very soon. Cheers.